Welcome to another episode of The Fire These Times. I'm your guest host for today. My name is Justin Salhani. I'm a writer and journalist based in Beirut. Today, I'm going to be speaking with the professor, journalist, and columnist Mohamad Bazzi about the situation in Lebanon, the site of a disproportionate war with Israel since October 2023 and the site of an Israeli invasion in October 2024. The original conversation took place on November 18th, before a ceasefire, which was put into place on November 27. We've also recorded a shorter update to discuss the ceasefire. We did that on December 3rd. That's it from me, so please enjoy the show. Welcome to an episode of The Fire These Times. I'm your host for today, Justin Salhani, and with me is the journalist, columnist, and professor Mohamad Bazzi. Mohamad, could you give us a brief introduction about yourself?
Thanks, Justin, for having me, for inviting me on. I'm Mohamad Bazzi. I'm a journalism professor at New York University. I'm also director of the Hagop Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies at NYU, and I was previously a correspondent and bureau chief for Newsday based in the Middle East. I was based in Baghdad and Beirut for a number of years. Um, and I've had a almost lifelong professional and personal connection to the Middle East. I'm from Lebanon. I'm from southern Lebanon. My family is from a town in the south called Bint Jbeil. And I've spent a good part of my life in Lebanon, both visiting and living there, but also a significant part of my professional life in Lebanon.
Great. And I guess that will really serve us as today. This is what we're going to talk about. Essentially, the situation in Lebanon today, the ongoing war that kicked off the day after October 7th on October 8th of 2023, as well as the escalation over the last couple of months. I'm speaking to you shortly after Israel struck central Beirut for the third time in 2 days. This comes after a few weeks of a bit of change of behavior, a way that actually a friend of mine recently said that something the Israelis are kind of experts at is making you feel that a rhythm has arrived, only to change that rhythm. And the rhythm of the last few days was intense bombing in the south and in the southern suburbs, as well as the east, in the Bekaa Valley. But central Beirut has not been hit for a few weeks now. It seemed that after there had been talks in the media about certain assurances from the Biden administration that attacks on Beirut would stop. Apparently, that didn't mean the southern suburbs, which is an integral part and connected to greater Beirut. But the attacks on central Beirut had stopped. And now we have 3 more in the last couple of days. So, Mohamad, I don't know if you have any thoughts. These strikes obviously come as there's a bunch of talk about potential ceasefire negotiations. Amos Hochstein, the U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, who's been kind of the lead negotiator, as for the Americans, but essentially being the intermediary between the Israelis and the Lebanese, is supposedly on his way to Beirut as we speak, or will leave shortly. So how do you make these sort of recent developments?
Yeah, I think your friend's observation, your friend's point about this rhythm that the Israelis establish, and then kind of it's one more layer of psychological warfare, one more layer of keeping people anxious, keeping people feeling hopeless, and it seems this escalation of the past few days, this weekend of attacking Beirut 3 times in a row, seems to be this additional pressure tactic to get Hezbollah to agree to a ceasefire, or to agree to the U.S.-Israeli terms of a ceasefire, um, and to maybe reinforce this point that there's no way out, that Israel holds most of the cards, and that the Biden administration does as well. and and also to convey that this idea of an open-ended war and an ever-escalating war is on the table, and that if Hezbollah doesn't accept the current ceasefire parameters, then it'll be an even more intensive war, and it'll be a more intensive round of attacks, and probably Israel seeing whatever assurances it gave to the Biden administration as null and void at this point, now that Trump has been elected. Um, Not that Israel or Netanyahu have had any problem in the past reneging on assurances and promises they've given the Biden administration. So on its own, those assurances have been pretty worthless. But it seems to be part of this escalation and just a ratcheting up of the pressure in ways that we hadn't seen in some time.
Right, right. And yeah, you mentioned, I mean, let's go into that a bit. You mentioned um, the Biden administration has basically not been able to shape the behavior of of the Israeli regime or of the Israeli military over the past year and couple of months. There's been a lot of talk about Biden's kind of bear hug policy or policy of trying to kind of shape things behind the scenes while maybe going kind of like a quiet slap on the wrist. There's been a number of these leaks about Biden calling Netanyahu, I think the accurate term was an asshole, saying that he can't stand that guy and all these sort of things, but then essentially greenlighting almost every weapons shipment. I think there was one shipment that was withheld briefly. So I mean, when looking at this last year, in terms of essentially how the Biden administration has tried to shape proceedings, I mean, is it fair to say that it's been anything other than a complete failure? And I mean, now that we have Trump coming into power, how do you see that playing out in maybe different ways? It's hard, a lot of people I think kind of had this idea that it can't get any worse. And while that may be true for, the slaughter ongoing in Gaza, like for the case of Lebanon as well, do you see kind of any sort of differences playing out?
Yeah, and the Biden administration's policy has been a complete failure and a disaster over the past year, over the past 13 months. You had, and many people have pointed this out, have warned about this, the failures of the bear hug strategy of Biden from early on, arguing that he could have more influence on Israel and on Netanyahu by being open, by basically turning on the pipeline of weapons and other military support. The other component of it that we don't hear very much about is the supply of jet fuel, which is pretty important to keep Israeli warplanes in the skies. And then other intelligence cooperation, sharing satellite information, sharing information that comes from spy planes, the many spy planes that the U.S. itself has in the region. And so that total package of military support, of military operations, and of the pipeline of weaponry, keeping that open, and Biden using the argument that he will have more influence on Netanyahu, and it was a total failure from the very beginning. We saw the signs from the earliest weeks and months of this war, where Netanyahu began ignoring Biden's requests. He ignored most of the administration's pleas to hang back, to lessen civilian casualties in Gaza, to allow humanitarian aid in, and that's one of the points that's kind of got lost in the debate in the U.S. is that Israel preventing aid from entering Gaza, Israel obstructing aid in the way it has from the very beginning, actually sets the groundwork. Biden didn't need to impose an arms embargo or didn't need to make a big break. All he needed to do was to say, under U.S. law, under the existing laws, preventing aid, obstructing aid in this situation means that Israel can no longer abiding by U.S. law, and he could have cut off the supply of weapons and military support at that point. He chose not to. And between Biden and Tony Blinken, they went out of their way to find excuses for Israel and to find reasons not to cut off that supply of weapons. And then we saw so many red lines. We saw Netanyahu blow through so many U.S. red lines where every time Biden would try to impose some red line or some boundary, Netanyahu would cross it and do it almost gleefully, and to show a domestic audience in Israel that he can stand up to the U.S., that he can get his way with a U.S. president. And with all of that, is it really any surprise that Netanyahu saw an opportunity to expand the war into Lebanon, to broaden the war, to bring the entire region on the brink of war with attacks that instigated Iran? And if that was the last red line that Biden had imposed, which for months and really for the first year of this war, we heard Biden administration officials eventually say, "Oh, please don't let this expand into a regional war. Don't let the war spill out of the borders of Gaza." And that's exactly what Netanyahu ended up doing in September, and the entire Israeli military and political establishment. That's what they did, because they never paid any price for going against U.S. wishes and going against Biden's. I can't even call them instructions, because there was no means of enforcing them. They were basically, pretty please, but Biden would say to Netanyahu, "Pretty please do this," and Netanyahu would stub his nose.
Right, and we saw that most recently with this 30-day deadline that was passed, and the amount of aid that was demanded by the U.S. was not met, and then they've still decided, despite recommendations, to not cut off aid or weapons to the Israelis. Speaking of essentially how Netanyahu blows by any sort of red lines or agreements, I want to take this back to the current ceasefire discussions. Obviously, the war here expanded in mid-September, which started with the pager incident it was the 17th, I believe, where Israel executed what was seemingly a years-long planned attack to detonate a number of electronic devices, first pagers, and the second day, I believe it was walkie-talkies, that killed a number of people ostensibly linked to Hezbollah, though it was reported as well that a number of civilians were damaged by this. I mean, this was an attack that was widely criticized by human rights groups for essentially being indiscriminate, in the sense that you cannot determine this large of an attack who is nearby. There were reports of people driving cars when their hands exploded, seeing people driving next to them, their hands exploded. I think it was at least 2 children were killed at the time. And then within a week, there was the most deadly day in Lebanese history since the end of the civil war in 1990, where Israel expanded its bombing campaign, which was followed as well a few days later by the assassination of Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. And shortly after, we also had the ground invasion into Lebanon. This has essentially been a massive escalation over the past couple months. In the meantime, there's been fighting in the south and incessant bombing in the south and east, with, as we discussed earlier, attacks on the southern suburbs and even into Beirut at times. There's also been targeted attacks around the country in almost every different region. Sometimes cars or motorcycles driving, sometimes buildings housing displaced people. With this in mind, and now we've got talks of a ceasefire ongoing. The last time there was talks of a ceasefire, obviously, was right before Nasrallah was killed, and the Lebanese foreign minister had said on CNN that the Lebanese side had agreed to a ceasefire, including Nasrallah himself had agreed to a ceasefire before his assassination. Just now, it seems that Netanyahu has delivered a speech in the Knesset where he said, a ceasefire is essentially what's on paper, but the important thing is countering Hezbollah's buildup, wherever that may be. What do you make of that? I mean, if a ceasefire is agreed upon, And we can go back maybe to the 2006 war, which, if I remember correctly, you were covering that war at the time. 2006 war ended with UN Resolution 1701, which essentially stipulated that Israel would pull back behind the blue line, and that Hezbollah would bring their forces north of the Litani, and the Lebanese army would deploy to the south. Of course, that's not really what happened. Israel continued to violate Lebanese airspace on a regular basis, and then Hezbollah also deployed, their military infrastructure to southern Lebanon. So, with that in mind, when we think about a coming ceasefire, how do you see this all playing out, considering these latest developments and who's in charge of Israel and his history with regards to American assurances, with Trump coming to power? I mean, with all these different sort of facets and factors coming together, how do you see these ceasefire negotiations playing out, and how do you see maybe the future of this cold or hot conflict playing out?
Yeah, you gave a great summary of what led us to this point in time, and one of the your quote from this most recent speech by Netanyahu to the Knesset just reminds me that this has been the pattern all along with Netanyahu, especially in how he's handled the Gaza ceasefire, where he basically, assisted by the Biden administration, has used the ceasefire and negotiations as a fig leaf to continue the genocide, to continue the war on Gaza, to continue killing, starving Palestinians. And a large part, the Biden administration played a part in that by continuing to insist that there were negotiations. And I mean, there were, but in many cases, Netanyahu would pull this trick of adding conditions. So even after Biden in May of this year announced his framework for the ceasefire, and then a new round of negotiations began in Doha with the Egyptian and Qatari mediators, and Hamas then, I think, surprised Netanyahu a few weeks later by accepting that framework, the Biden framework. And lo and behold, Netanyahu started to add new conditions because he didn't want an end to the war. And he didn't think that Hamas was going to accept the framework in the way that they did. And so he began adding conditions. And the Biden administration's response at the time, and it's been consistent all along, is instead of blaming Netanyahu for being the major obstacle to the ceasefire, they would blame Hamas. And I can see something similar playing out. I hope it doesn't play out this way in Lebanon. I think Netanyahu has some different interests in Lebanon and in the current war, but he's also perfectly capable of adding conditions at the last minute to blow up the ceasefire negotiations, essentially. And he knows the Biden administration won't impose any cost on him. One factor in this, one potential ray of hope, is there's been speculation in the US and in Washington that Netanyahu needs to give the incoming administration some kind of gift. And one possibility is that he would agree to a temporary, the 60-day ceasefire that's on the table right now, and which roughly brings us to January 20th, around January 20th, when Trump would be inaugurated. And then there would be a more permanent type deal on the table once Trump is in office, and so Netanyahu can deliver this deal to Trump to show that Trump is the peacemaker and Trump is the one who can end these wars. And and we've seen reports that people around Trump have tried to leak and say that he wants to have progress. He doesn't want to start his second term with these two wars going on, and Trump seems to have a little more sympathy for the Lebanese. It's not entirely clear, but he seems to have a little more sympathy for the Lebanese than he has for Palestinians. In the grand scheme of things, we don't know if that's going to make any difference. I mean, we saw Kamala Harris expressed significantly more sympathy for Palestinians than Joe Biden did, but that didn't make any difference in her policies and in her approach to the war. So I think one of the factors driving Netanyahu right now is he did make a promise within Israel. He made a promise. He wanted to get Israelis who live in the north back into their homes. And part of the argument behind expanding the war that he's launched against Lebanon is that it would make it possible for those Israelis to get back into their homes. Of course, we now see even a larger number of Israelis and a greater range of Israeli territory that's subject to Hezbollah's rocket fire and missile fire. So what's ended up happening is that there's now even more Israelis, within the danger zone, and so there is domestic pressure on him. And now that the initial euphoria that we saw in Israel after killing Hassan Nasrallah and after these what appeared to be devastating blows against Hezbollah in the early weeks of the war, of the expanded war, that's died down, and Israelis are asking Netanyahu and his government once again, when will those residents of northern Israel be able to go back into their homes? So that puts a different kind of pressure on Netanyahu than he's been facing in Gaza.
Speaking of Hezbollah, I mean, you mentioned, they've lost pretty much the entirety of their senior military leadership. Um, how do you see? I mean, as you mentioned, though, they still have been able to engage with Israelis in South Lebanon on the ground, as well as being able to fire, numerous rockets back into Israel. That being said, I think it's important. Oftentimes, we see in the media there's talk of kind of like a tit for tat exchange of rocket fire, though. While those numbers may have changed in recent weeks, as of about a month ago or so, there was kind of a 4-to-1 or 4.5-to-1 disparity between the number of rockets coming from Israel and the number of rockets coming from Lebanon. So the Israelis were shooting almost 4.5 to almost nearly 5 times as many rockets or strikes on Lebanese territory than what was going in the other direction. And I think that disparity is important, but Hezbollah has managed to kind of survive, at least in this moment. They're not completely devastated, at least in the sense of resisting Israeli presence. And despite that, the strength of the Israeli military being, the regional power. I'm wondering what can we say about Hezbollah currently as an organization? How much do we know as a military organization and otherwise? Obviously, internally, politically, there's been a number of challengers to Hezbollah, especially in recent weeks. Even, one of their strongest Christian allies, the Free Patriotic Movement, their leader, Gibran Bassil, came out recently and kind of gave or was speaking to I believe local media and kind of said that partnership or that allyship was over, or at least not continuing in the same way that it had been in recent years. What do we know about Hezbollah as an organization at this moment, and what are some of maybe the big questions about what this organization can continue to be going forward?
Yeah, you've brought up a lot of themes, Justin, and I want to take one of the first topics you brought up, which is the disparity in attacks, the disparity in this war, and it's we certainly seen it in Gaza on an extreme scale. We see it in Lebanon on quite a scale as well. I mean, I'll if I can just bring us back to that day you mentioned, I believe was September 23rd, the day of the most severe Israeli escalation. So that was after a few days after the pager and walkie-talkie explosions, after those bombings, which were many human rights groups and experts on international law pointed out those were war crimes because they were indiscriminate attacks that ended up injuring and killing civilians. And so on September 23rd, you had dozens of Israeli warplanes began raining bombs and missiles all across Lebanon. And I like to point out those were U.S.-made warplanes, and for the most part, they were raining U.S.-made bombs. We don't know if all the bombs were Israeli-made or were U.S.-made, but some of them could have been made by Israel and obtained in other sources. But for the most part, almost all of those planes were entirely U.S.-made because Israel doesn't make its own warplanes. And And so here, with pretty intense U.S. complicity, you had Israel carrying out what ended up being one of the most intense aerial bombardments in modern history, intense single-day aerial bombardments. I think the death toll approached something like 600 people, injured 2,000 people within that 24-hour period. And I think the Israelis claimed attacking something like 1,600 targets. And that caused extreme panic in Lebanon. I mean, you were there, you were on the ground, and you know what had happened. So this was in many ways, this was Israel exporting the most brutal tactics of its Gaza war into Lebanon. So it's massive bombardment and displacement of civilians, and trying to get this sense across that nowhere is safe in Lebanon, and a kind of what the Americans, what the Bush administration had called the shock and awe campaign in Iraq and elsewhere. So that strategy of trying to overwhelm your opponent, trying to strike fear, and clearly in those initial weeks, starting with the pager and walkie-talkie explosions, Hezbollah was knocked off. It was surprised. It was surprised by the depth of Israeli penetration of its communication systems, its military systems, its ability to identify targets, its ability to track not just top leadership, but mid-level leadership. And so Hezbollah sustained very severe losses in those early weeks. And then multiple phases. Then there was the next escalation of the massive bombing of Dahi that killed Hassan Nasrallah, while Benjamin Netanyahu was speaking to the UN. And perhaps in some ways, Nasrallah and the other top Hezbollah leadership were lulled into a fake sense of safety at that point, where they thought, how could there were discussions of a ceasefire at that point, and as you pointed out, the Lebanese prime minister said in some press interviews that Hezbollah and the Lebanese government had agreed to a ceasefire by that point. So that was a few days after September 23rd, the very intense Israeli attacks. Nasrallah was still alive, and then Nasrallah was killed, and Israel decided to expand the war. And even then, you would see that Hezbollah kept up. I mean, they were off balance certainly for several days and several weeks, but they kept up being able to fire rockets. Some days they were able to fire even more larger volleys of rockets at northern Israel and at other points in Israel. And so Hezbollah wanted to show that it was weakened. It had taken severe hits. Such a large portion of military and political leadership had been taken out. But it was still capable of operating, and it was still able to fight back. Now, one of the things that we should note here is that there is also a disconnect between certainly the things I see on social media, and I'm sure that you see, of the Hezbollah supporters and the kind of propaganda of that Hezbollah is winning and holding out the Israelis. I mean, that's also ridiculous. And I mean, Lebanon has sustained far greater damage than it has in 2006. The international attention on this is not the same as it was in 2006, where where it was fairly obvious that Gulf countries, that Iran, that others in the international community were going to help with rebuilding. That's an open question now. It's not entirely clear where that help will come from. Iran is not in the same kind of position it was in 2006 to help. The Gulf countries are far less interested in being involved in Lebanon than they were in 2006. So there are all of these factors. And the level of Israeli destruction we've seen has been much more massive right now, today, in 2024 than in 2006. And so Israel wasn't caught off balance this time in the way, I mean, it had the momentum going in, because clearly, as you pointed out, they had been planning for the pager explosions and for the security penetration of Hezbollah. They had been planning for this for years, long before October 7th. and they were able to carry that out in ways that significantly damaged Hezbollah. What are its military capabilities now? I'm not sure we know. I'm not sure beyond a small circle of people truly know what those capabilities are. Um, but it seems to have sustained more damage than it's admitting. And the stockpiles of missiles and weapons that they have been damaged, reduced, used up. Um, and also Hezbollah hasn't been able to do the kind of damage to Israeli infrastructure um, and military resources as it had promised and as it had said, and especially Hassan Nasrallah had said it would be able to do. Um, it would be able to inflict. It hasn't been able to inflict the kind of damage on Israel that Nasrallah had promised would be the deterrent of Hezbollah having the weapons that it had.
Yeah, I think you bring up an interesting point about how much damage and how many casualties Hezbollah has been able to inflict. And particularly, like you said, the stuff on social media and kind of the talk about Hezbollah is almost winning. I remember I saw a group of people and I asked them if they knew how many casualties the Israelis had sustained, and they had said, "Oh, it must be tons and tons." Um, well, I'm not sure about total casualties, but I think that Israel and I've heard reports in the past that Israel tends to underreport at times, but the figures they've released as of quite recently is about 110 soldiers and civilians. I think about 40 civilians and 110 soldiers. Of course, many of those soldiers are also, people who have died fighting in the south. So the actual damage from the rockets themselves is significantly lower. Furthermore, oftentimes the people who have been hit by these rockets tend to be, people who may not have the same access to shelters. At least we've seen some reports of that, a Bedouin here, or, there was Majd al-Shams as well, is obviously an area that's considered occupied Syria. Whereas on the Lebanese side, the number is closely approaching 3,500 people since October of last year. And as you mentioned, there's been years and years to plan for the pager attack, to gather intelligence, to figure out, the comings and goings and locations of all these different Hezbollah operatives or other figures. I'm wondering if we can talk briefly about the Dahya doctrine, which, for those who don't know, is something that, to my knowledge, was developed during the 2006 war, which was essentially a strategy of disproportionality that the Israelis enact, and they develop through the name of Dahya, which is the Beirut's periphery or southern suburb area, which is a large, extended, quite dense, largely residential area where Hezbollah does have offices and commit political operations and gatherings, but also has a large diversity of people and beliefs and life and businesses and everything else like that. I wrote a piece recently for Al Jazeera about herbicides in Dahya, which is essentially the killing of a city, which I can attach in the show notes. Early on, one thing we saw in local Lebanese news was each night various TV channels would go and set up cameras to capture the damage to once they started hitting Dahya in this way in the last few weeks. And you would see these very spectacular, spectacular in a grandiose sense, images of just like bursts of flame, coming out of the ground. And so Israel was claiming that they were hitting, weapons depots and things of that nature. I spoke to a military analyst who told me, when you see secondary explosions and flight of certain things, that typically can be the case. In recent days, in the last few days, however, we've seen a lot more just of like buildings being taken down. So it means that the targets have potentially changed. A lot of locals I've spoken to say that, they don't really know what the targets are. Israelis have claimed at different points that, Shia people in Lebanon will have weapons stored in their home. And I think it was Israel Katz who said something like, they get like a monthly bonus or something like that. It was some nonsense that was immediately, denied by almost anyone of reason and logic. but speaking to people there, they've said things like, look, at first there were potentially weapons depots or maybe fuel depots that were hit, but now what's left? What's being hit, and there's been put forward the idea that damage is just being done for the sake of damage, to destroy as much as possible, to put pressure on Hezbollah. And this would fall in line with this Dahya doctrine, this doctrine of disproportionality and mass damage as an act of deterrence, as also as a means of putting pressure on the opponent to try to bring them to either to submit or to bring them to the table and kind of agree to better terms, in regards to a ceasefire. So in terms of what you've seen and comparing that maybe a bit with your experience in 2006, do you think it's fair to call what we're seeing now, is this an extension of the Dahiya doctrine, or is maybe this something different than past experiences?
I think it is an extension of the Dahi doctrine in some ways, but it's also something different and even on a larger scale and maybe even more punitive. And I know some people have called it the Gaza doctrine, that this is a new Israeli form of collective punishment of certainly of ethnic cleansing, of all of the things that they're carrying out in Gaza, and in Lebanon. The aim, as you put it, is to punish people, to put pressure for a ceasefire that would be reached under Israel's terms. I think also one of the aims is to sort of make the Shia community in Lebanon as poor as possible, and to make it as to sort of deprive it of the resources, of the wealth it was able to build, especially of the wealth that people were able to build in other countries by working for many years outside of Lebanon, and sending money back, either to themselves, or sending money to family members, investing money in businesses in Lebanon, in businesses in Dahi, in businesses in the south, investing their money in building homes in southern Lebanon that have now been dynamited or bombed in other ways. And so part of the strategy seems to be to punish the entire Shia community, and to make it as poor as possible, to deprive it of resources. And part of the Israeli argument seems to be that you do that, then you deprive Hezbollah of potential future support. That somehow then people will turn against Hezbollah, and not support it. The problem, of course, is that Israelis have forgotten all their recent history, going back to their experience with the PLO in the 1970s in Lebanon, and also their experience with the invasion in 1982, of thinking they can bomb their way and fight their way to peace. The only thing that Netanyahu and his government seem to be capable of doing is to expand the war, bomb more people, kill more people. They have no we've all heard and talked a lot about the lack of an end game in Gaza. It's not entirely clear that there's even an end game for Lebanon either, or Hezbollah. So other than this massive bombardment of people, massive killing of civilians, massive displacement of civilians, attempts to sow sectarian hatred and to start a civil war in Lebanon, or to start some kind of civil strife. All of these attempts to break Lebanese society down in as many different ways as possible. But the history shows that, as Israel, we can talk a bit more in depth about this, but in 1982, when Israel invaded to push the PLO out of Lebanon, they were successful at pushing the PLO out, but they also helped create Hezbollah. And I think we can argue that Hezbollah is the most dangerous military force that Israel has certainly encountered in the modern era. It's certainly the only Arab military force that was ever able to force Israel to relinquish land without a peace agreement. I mean, none of the Arab armies managed to do that through all of the previous wars. But in May of 2000, the Israelis withdrew from southern Lebanon after the extremely deadly and failed occupation of that really started in 1978 and then kind of extended post 1982 and then post 1985. And so Hezbollah was one Arab military force that was able to pressure Israel to do that. And in some ways, there are people in the Israeli military establishment, and probably Netanyahu among them, and others that still feel that are still hurt by this in some way, and maybe want to impose a kind of an extra punishment, an extra damage on Lebanon, on southern Lebanon in particular. I think there was a reason in 2006 during that war that the Israelis targeted particular towns, particular communities. One of them was my hometown, Vintage Be'er, where the Israelis really wanted to occupy Vintage Be'er in 2006 because Nasrallah had gone to speak there in May after May of 2000 when the Israelis withdrew, and when Hezbollah was sort of celebrating the liberation of the South, and so there was an effort at this kind of punishment, and I think we're seeing that play out again, but on an even more massive scale. We see it in the targeting of Qard al-Hassan, of the benevolent loan, and and the social service, the charities, all of the civilian infrastructure and that's attached to Hezbollah and that's in Hezbollah's orbit. And we see Israel trying to claim that all of these are legitimate targets, and no one in the West, no one who claims to care about international law will do anything to try to stop it or to say, wait a minute, this is actually very clearly against international law and very clearly a targeting of civilian infrastructure in ways that you should not be doing in war.
Yeah, you bring up a number of really interesting points. The thing about the extra punishment is interesting because Benny Gantz, who is one of Netanyahu's biggest opponents, but as many Israeli analysts have said, doesn't have much of a political imagination that's that different from Netanyahu, recently released a video essentially arguing that they need to reoccupy the South. He was essentially the guy, if I'm not mistaken, who kind of like locked the door behind them when they left in 2000. He was responsible for the military at that point in time. Also, kind of this idea of punishing the community to making them poorer. I find that a bizarre, kind of a strange tactic, especially because we've been reporting here a lot on the displaced, and so many of the displaced. The responsibility for housing them and feeding them has been taken on by the parties, by Hezbollah, by Harakat Amal, by the SSNP, by Hezbollah and their allies. And so in a sense, what you're seeing is kind of this entrenching of the patronage system that already exists in the country. So in a sense, what we see doing, maybe this strategy is taking on different manifestations in different ways, but at least one of these manifestations is these people who are needing to rely on, and these of course are typically people who are of lower means, who maybe don't have the money made, from abroad that can afford to rent a house somewhere else in the country. But they're, essentially relying fully on these parties, whether or not there is animosity, I think is not necessarily fair to say, because there may be and there may not be. But in essence, what you're still doing is forcing these people, rather than being on their own land and relying on their own land and on, their own jobs and means of making an income and kind of agency, now they're completely reliant and returning to this patronage network of being forced to rely on political parties, essentially giving them more power over themselves. So I found that quite bizarre. But speaking of what the last thing you said, which is this kind of view of international law, targeting civilian infrastructure. I'm wondering if we can jump a bit to, your role today as a journalism professor. One of the things I think you and I have probably both been very disappointed about in the last year and some has been the media reaction, particularly the Western media reaction and coverage of these sort of issues. And particularly, when we talk about the disparity of power, the disparity of attacks, the disparity of deaths, and how it's often portrayed as kind of a, maybe an even fight, or a, this was done and therefore this reaction is justified, despite constant violations of international law, despite any sort of proposition or law of proportionality have been completely thrown out the door without really being questioned. And then, of course, that also applies to things like negotiations. The coverage of negotiations, we've seen so many times, so many commentators say things like, if we go to Gaza for a minute, we see things like, Sinwar and Netanyahu, or Hamas and Netanyahu, despite the fact that it was reported quite clearly, Hamas may have had disagreements and within them, and it's an organization like any political organization in the sense of how they may negotiate and have disagreements internally, but it became clear that even when there seemed to be acceptance from the Hamas side, Netanyahu, as you said, threw in new conditions, and then this was reported as they cannot come to a deal, rather than one side is kind of obstructing. In your role as a journalism professor, what sort of advice would you maybe give to journalists, reporters, people who are trying to navigate this current moment that is quite fraught, that is quite difficult, but is also quite clear I mean, maybe I'll say these are my words, but would you agree that maybe, is it fair to say that we've been let down by so many in predominantly Western media?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would say the legacy media, especially in the West, has failed miserably in covering Gaza and covering the genocide and covering Israel's actions, most of Israel's actions over the past year, including expanding the war into Lebanon. Um, Many editors and gatekeepers will wring their hands and say, "Why don't people trust the media anymore?" Especially in the West. Why is there all this disinformation on social media and elsewhere? Why don't people trust us? And they ask these questions with a straight face, not acknowledging their own behavior and the ways that they've covered Gaza, the ways they've covered Israel's war, the ways they've covered the past 13 months. Never mind, we can go back decades, but even just keeping it focused on the past 13 months or so. They ask these questions with a straight face, as if they're the paragon of journalistic integrity, and they can't get past this old form of thinking about disinformation and thinking about all the pressures they're under. Yes, there are concerted disinformation campaigns by states and other actors, but there's also the behavior of the legacy media itself, which has severely undermined its own credibility, especially in the way it's covered Gaza and now Lebanon. And those are really prime examples, prime current examples of the ways that the legacy media, the mainstream media in the West has failed at doing its most basic functions. And news consumers, people aren't stupid. People can see the reality that's portrayed on social media. They can see the reality that they can find in some independent media, and they can see that if they seek it out, they can see this whole other world that they're not seeing in the traditional legacy media coverage. And so, of course, they're undermining their own credibility and their ability to reach people because of the way they've covered this. So, one of the things I noticed, and maybe I think you and I had a conversation on some aspect of this, is just also the way that so many U.S. journalists and news organizations have been so silent on the treatment of Palestinian journalists, on the targeting of Palestinian journalists by Israel. I mean, if there was one thing that U.S. journalists and media organizations should be relatively free and should be relatively able to speak about, it's the targeting of journalists, of the targeting of their own colleagues. Instead, there's been tremendous silence, except for a few. There are a few exceptions. One of them is the Committee to Protect Journalists, who've done an excellent job monitoring and tracking the killing of journalists in Gaza. And a few weeks before the U.S. election, we saw this episode where I think it was impressive that U.S. journalists and news organizations were outraged that the two billionaire owners of the LA Times and the Washington Post had apparently stopped their editorial boards from endorsing Kamala Harris for president. We heard a lot of rhetoric about preserving democracy and standing up to fascism, standing up to Trump. But these same journalists and news organizations expressed so little concern about Israel killing. The numbers are. I think the CPJ numbers at that point were around 130. Just to use let's use the CPJ figure. There are higher figures from other sources. Or around that same time, Israel had accused 6 Al Jazeera journalists in Gaza being members of Hamas or Islamic Jihad. So that raised real concerns that those journalists would be targeted for assassination by the Israeli military. Around that same time, also, Israel killed 3 journalists in an airstrike in southern Lebanon. So all of this happened within a week. All of these events, I'm not compressing months of events. This all basically happened in a week. And journalists and news organizations in the West, and especially in the US, they couldn't seem to comprehend that press freedom can't be protected if US journalists and media organizations can stand up for it at home, but they fail to stand up for it around the world. And especially when the biggest threat to press freedom over the past year has been a US ally, it's been Israel. So if you can't point out that basic level of hypocrisy or double standard, then you lose most of your credibility to be able to speak about the importance of protecting press freedom.
Yeah, and I think that can extend to things like diplomacy. I remember, shortly after the war in Gaza started, there was a piece in the New York Times essentially saying why so many diplomats or leaders or governments in the global South essentially weren't signing on to support Western initiatives towards Ukraine. And what these diplomats kind of said from the global South was, we think the West doesn't really care about these values; they care about their own interests. And so we're trying to hedge our bets and kind of act in the same way, like we're reflecting what we kind of see in the world. And I remember the piece ended with kind of I think it was a Western diplomat basically saying, yeah, we recognize that, but we think we can still get them on board despite everything else. So it's kind of this like wider hypocrisy, and even, I think a deeply entrenched Orientalism. I actually want to read one of your posts, if you'll allow me, from that I saw in Blue Sky just yesterday. You write, "O glorious nytimes.com, please enlighten us on how Arabs and other Middle Easterners treat foreign policy as a bazaar, while the US and Western powers pursue grand policies that seek the betterment of humankind." And you're quoting, you've highlighted a piece from a New York Times piece that basically says, for many countries in the Middle East, transactional foreign policy is a way of life, which is almost a laughable sort of, Orientalist statement that's in, essentially the paper of record. But what we've seen, and to be clear, I think, and you can speak to this better than I can, this has been something that's existed for generations in the United States and in the West, this kind of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, and the spaces that intersect attitude. And if you allow me, I'll bring back, I don't know if you remember, there was that video that went viral about a little more than a year ago, of somebody who had some position in the Obama administration at some point. I think he had kept his position into later administrations anyways, but he was caught talking to an Egyptian food truck vendor and essentially telling him he was going to send him to the Mukhabarat, he was going to get his fingernails pulled out. And he was doing it so casually that it was quite terrifying. The guy was later on arrested, but then people kind of had this outrage. To me, at that time, when I saw that video, there was a lot of shock around that video. I personally, like, as somebody who grew up in the United States, as somebody with an Arab name and an Arab identity, particularly in the post 9/11, but though not exclusively, because I think a lot of those attitudes existed before 9/11 as well, but were maybe more openly expressed post 9/11. I wasn't shocked and I wasn't surprised. And I think the reason for that is that I think those levels of racism towards Arabs, the idea that Arabs are these kind of backwards, patriarchal, what's the word I'm looking for? Savage kind of person continues to exist, and it exists on a spectrum. Now, the way that person was speaking was in the, on the farther end of the spectrum, the most openly, blatantly racist, discriminatory, Orientalist part of that spectrum. But I think even many of the people in government, and I would go as high up as Antony Blinken and Joseph Biden themselves, also carry those sort of perceptions within themselves. And that's how they can continue to support the Israeli government, despite the vast disparity of death, the vast disparity of human suffering, despite all these images. When you look at somebody like Matt Miller, continue day after day to take these sort of questions from these journalists, either he's not listening and not hearing the things that people are telling him, or he's hearing them and he knows about them he's very well aware of them, which I would suspect. And he still is able to get up there every day and kind of spin this and kind of defend these actions. I think there has to be a certain level of deeply embedded Orientalism and racism to be able to continue to do that for months and months and months, now going on 14 months.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, and like these cases, the examples you've mentioned are all are great examples of that, and the ways that this seeps into U.S. foreign policy, ways it seeps into the media and to other centers of power in the U.S. One of the things that I think one of the few positives that might actually come out of the Trump administration's foreign policy is that we'll no longer hear these grandiose pronouncements about human rights and democracy, sort of like other U.S. presidents and administrations that basically put on this veneer, this fake rhetoric of wanting to advance U.S. ideals and wanting to help the savages improve their lives. Trump doesn't care about that. He doesn't even bother. He doesn't waste time with that. And in some ways, it's refreshing. It's a refreshing way to look at U.S. foreign policy. It strips it down to its most basic level. It strips it down to the transactional self-interest, the interests of the U.S. empire, the interests of U.S. foreign policy to advance often short-term U.S. interests. There's no ideas at stake, and in some ways it'll be refreshing, not to hear from George W. Bush or Obama or Biden. They make these grand pronouncements about respecting human rights while at the same time they invade and bomb and enable genocide in the Middle East. Trump will be more straightforward about it. He'll basically say what's on his mind, and he'll say it's about sort of this America first idea, and he's not trying to export democracy to anyone. He wants to curtail it at home as well. So it's not a sort of the whole the mask will be off in many ways, and over the past 13 months, really over several decades, the mask of U.S. foreign policy has been off for most of the world, but we'll see it come off even more. We've seen it come off even more, certainly over the past year. I mean, we've seen Biden and other Western leaders, but especially Biden, we've seen them being willing to risk the entire post-war international order, the entire system that they had been invested in, and especially kind of democratic and liberal leaders had been invested in. We saw them risk all of that to protect Israel and to protect Netanyahu. They wanted to protect Israel at the International Court of Justice, and they wanted to protect Netanyahu and Gallant and other Israeli officials at the International Criminal Court. So they're willing for the entire system to collapse, for that entire liberal order to be brought down in order to protect Israel. And when you see that, when that becomes clear, you sort of throw your hands up and say, well, what hope is there? What hope is there left to preserve this system that's decayed to this level?
Yeah. Speaking of hope. I mean, I think we're in a very difficult period. What is maybe the most that you feel you can hope for? What do you find yourself hoping for, considering that, you still have family in the country? Um, with these current developments, what's maybe the thing that you find yourself hoping for the most, or what's maybe the best case scenario we can see ourselves entering in the near future? Maybe let's go near and then maybe
Yeah.
medium future as well, just in the sense of like,
Mm-hmm.
what are things that we can work towards?
Sure. Yeah, I think, one of the smaller scale things that is giving me some hope is the way that civil society has responded in Lebanon, as it has, for the past several decades, but especially the way it's responded to the evacuees, to the refugees, to the internal displacement, the way it's been able to help, the way it's been able to come together and pool resources to make up for the shortfalls of the Lebanese government, and also to offer a counterweight to the sectarian political parties that you were talking about earlier, to be able to offer, as much as possible. Civil society doesn't have the same sorts of resources. It doesn't have the kinds of resources that those groups have, but it's able to uh, respond, and it has shown that basically since the economic collapse in 2019, and then since that, and then after the port explosion. So it's shown that time and time again that civil society, and the small non-sectarian political movements in the country are able to cross sectarian boundaries in ways that are meaningful and that actually help people. Um, are they able to do it on a countrywide scale, on a national scale that will change the political structure? Not yet. But maybe this will be the opening. Maybe this will be one of the openings that gets us to that point, that gets us to the point where it's been clear now for quite a long time, for several decades, but it's certainly been even more clear since the financial crisis in 2019, that that Lebanon can't continue to live and operate in as this sectarian, gerrymandered place that it's been operating under for so many decades since the end of the Civil War. Um, and so I would like to hope I'd like that would be the longer term hope, that we see an end to the sectarian political structure as a result of this awful war. Unfortunately, it's probably still years off, and there are many interests that are going to hold on um, to the sectarian political structure that are not going to let go of it. And I know there's a whole debate within liberals and civil society and others and progressives and others in Lebanon about Hezbollah's role in keeping that structure in place. And it certainly has. Hezbollah has played a role in keeping that structure in place for quite a long time. And Hezbollah, made a decision also after the financial collapse to help preserve the system. Instead of it was the player on the scene that could have had the most impact and the most ability to change the system at that point, and it chose not to do that. That was a huge mistake, I think, in retrospect. But it chose not to do that and to continue to be part of the system. Um, at this point, maybe that's the. I'd like to think that that's the opening, but that also there are a lot of factors to that as well. That also means less foreign intervention, which is difficult to see at this point. It means other factors, other actors in the region, kind of allowing the Lebanese to decide things for themselves in ways that they haven't been able to do in a long time.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's well said. It's interesting because we have seen a lot from the civil society. We've seen incredible solidarity across sect and community. And I think in a lot of ways, while maybe politically this country hasn't come together necessarily, there have been very human moments, and there have been this possible, and with them have come up certain possibility, like you said, for the opportunity to maybe see a different part of the country, to learn about somebody a bit different from yourself, to kind of this intermixing and intermingling, which, because the country is so divided up, bisect. You know, I don't want to pretend like it doesn't happen. It does, but it's you know, there in certain areas you're seeing it more than you might on a normal basis. So that with that comes an opportunity, and hopefully that's one that's not entirely lost, like you mentioned. Um, yeah, I think for me, my hope in the short term is a ceasefire, just that this, you know, this can all stop, that people can, you know, even if it stops tomorrow, there will still be certain areas where people will not be able to go back to for a long time. And we talked about the damage, the destruction of homes. There's also concerns about environmental damage, things like white phosphorus use. You know, even if that usage may not have completely ravished lands, there's a psychological aspect as well that, you know, there's talk amongst people about, you know, the fact that these sort of munitions have been used. And then there's talks amongst locals of fear of coming into contact with things. I don't know if you've heard this after 2006, but people have told me things like cancer rates went up. I'm not sure if that's something that necessarily was proven by you know, scientific data, but this is sort of the wider perception that leads to a fear of not wanting to return to a certain place, or not wanting to help stimulate the economy. You know, I've heard people say things like they're not going to be buying olive oil from the south for quite a long time. So even if today the damage is stopped, there's still a long way to go before we can get back to a sense of normality in the country, I think. But I share your hope that um, you know, this horrible situation could still act as some kind of springboard going into the future, that these sort of secular forces and kind of non-sectarian forces, these kind of forces that are maybe more focused on you know, a political program for the future that works outside of this traditional sectarian framework, might be able to build up steam and might be able to react in a way that will provide a platform for a national program going forward as well. Um, I think, you know, I think we've covered a lot up until this point. I don't know if you have any kind of last thoughts that you'd like to share. And right after that, what I'd like to ask you to do, if you can, is just maybe suggest three books. They can be on the subject or completely off the subject. But just three books that have maybe been you know, three of your favorite books, or three books that have been inspirational to you in terms of your career, and yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Yeah, so as far as other thoughts, I agree with you for sure. The short term, you know, the ceasefire, you know, we need to get the ceasefire to stop the bloodshed, to stop the enormous destruction that Israel has unleashed on Lebanon, and for people to begin that process of going back to their homes in the south, in the Bekaa and the Dahi, and all of the areas that have been devastated so heavily, and also to have some space and time for people to assess the damage. I know there was I think it was a World Bank assessment that came out last week, and you know, I'm trying to remember the figures. It was something like the destruction. It's just the physical destruction was upwards of $3 billion, and then there's the just destruction, the impact on GDP, the economic impact. I think the figure was something like $8 billion. The economic losses as a whole, which is probably close to the entire year's GDP of Lebanon, maybe. So it's a huge, you know, these are huge figures. I mean, you know, in the West, of course, when you compare them to the amount of weapons that Israel has gotten, they pale in comparison. I mean, the costs of war project, Brown University issued a report in early October. They were assessing the figures. They tried to compile the figures, and they found that Israel had received almost $18 billion in direct weapons and other military aid. And then on top of that, the US had spent another 4.7 billion on its own military operations in the region. So you had this insane, you know, 22 billion plus, $22 billion or so that the U.S. had spent directly on this war since October 7th. You know, and at the same time, you would see things domestically in the U.S. where you had at one point toward the end of the summer, FEMA, the federal the federal aid relief agency, was running out of money because it didn't have enough allocation. There were more hurricanes than expected, and so you kind of begin to wonder. It's one reason that Americans are also sick of paying of their tax dollars. These are all U.S. taxpayer dollars going to fund these wars. And is it any surprise that someone like Trump, who made a big deal of saying he was going to stop these wars, he was going to stop support. He didn't say stop support to Israel, but when all of these things play out, and you see the amount of resources that this war machine, the amount of resources it takes up, that can be, and it can be directed to so many other things. So yes, but as a first step, we hopefully will get to that ceasefire, and then then there are the openings for much deeper discussion and inside Lebanon, and about how to move forward, how to change course after this war.
And so which three books would you recommend to listeners?
So this is off the top of my head on books that will provide context on the topics we've talked about. First I thought of Rashid Khalidi's masterful work, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, which I'm sure many of your listeners have encountered before, but it's the history. It provides the history and context on our current moment. On Lebanon, Beware of Small States by David Hirst, a journalist who lived and worked in Lebanon for many years, and provides important context on the wars, certainly the Israeli invasion in 1982 and afterward. And then Fawaz Traboulsi's book, A History of Modern Lebanon, really kind of the best, I think that one of the best modern history of Lebanon that we have. So those are the three that come to mind.
Great. Mohamad, thank you so much for your time and for speaking to us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So this is an addendum to a conversation that Mohamad and I had a couple of weeks ago now. On Wednesday, November 27, a ceasefire went into effect between Hezbollah and Israel at 4 o'clock in the morning. Under that agreement, essentially over the next 60 days, the Israeli army would pull their troops out of South Lebanon, where they've invaded since they've had an operation ongoing on Lebanese territory since October. Hezbollah would move their forces north of the Litani River and deploy the Lebanese army south into that area. These are the broad strokes of the agreements that include more particular mechanisms that include how to implement this, how to monitor various infractions. So, Mohamad, do you want to talk a little bit about maybe kind of widely this ceasefire agreement and how you view it, and how do you think that whether this can work towards keeping a peace? And maybe we can also discuss how it's gone over the past week.
Sure. Thank you for having me on again for this addendum. I think in the broader sense, this ceasefire seems to be the least that the U.S. and the Biden administration can aspire to after they've made a mess of their response and after the unwavering support that Biden decided to provide Israel and to provide Netanyahu since October 7th last year. So the U.S. and Biden wanted to accomplish something relatively small in the grand scheme of things, because we still have an ongoing war and an ongoing Israeli genocide against Gaza. We now see some former Israeli defense officials and others talking openly about the ethnic cleansing that's going on, and not just the most extremist members of Netanyahu's government, but we have a former defense minister, former Likud defense minister, who's openly acknowledging the ethnic cleansing. And so this leaves Biden, who seems to be very concerned with his legacy, this leaves him with something relatively small to accomplish, which is to have a ceasefire in Lebanon. And let's remember that the Biden administration itself seems to have given a green light back in September when Israel decided to escalate the war, when they went through with the pager explosions and then this series of intense bombardment in late September, and the assassination of the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. All of those steps, while the U.S. and the Biden administration was publicly insisting that they didn't want the war to expand out of Gaza, they didn't want the war to expand into Lebanon. We also saw anonymous administration officials leaking that they were supportive of Israel's escalation, and we had this Orwellian term where some Biden administration officials talked about de-escalation through escalation in some of the leaks that they issued. So at the very least, the Biden administration now has a ceasefire, but like everything else that's happened over the past 14 months, Biden failed to use the leverage he has over Netanyahu, over the Israeli government, which is the immense amount of weaponry and political support that the U.S. has provided. And so we have a lopsided ceasefire deal where Netanyahu basically got everything he wanted. We know the general terms of the ceasefire that have been published by the Lebanese cabinet and others, but we don't know is the text of a supposed side letter that the Biden administration provided to Israel, which Netanyahu insists gives Israel full military freedom to operate and basically carry out attacks against Hezbollah, against Lebanon, anytime and any place it wants to. That seems to be how the Israeli military has interpreted this side letter, and we've now seen over 100 violations of the ceasefire by Israel. This is according to UNIFIL sources that have leaked it to the U.S. media and elsewhere. And so this is the whole situation is very precarious, and it's the logical conclusion to how the Biden administration has handled its policy toward Israel from right after October 7th.
Yeah, actually, interestingly enough, in the lead up to the ceasefire, which Netanyahu gave us a statement, or I think a televised speech the night before. So the ceasefire went into effect Wednesday morning at 4 a.m. The day before that was one of the most violent days in this escalation, probably since that first day where about 550 people were killed. I myself and the Hamra neighborhood got an evacuation warning at one point. It was far away enough from my house that I was able to get to my home and stay in my home, but there was a bit of chaos in our neighborhood as well. And so it was a quite jarring 24 hours and waiting for that last bit to come. As you mentioned, there's been, according at least CNN reported, according to UNIFIL sources, that over 100 violations have occurred. Israeli media was reporting yesterday that the French, who are part of this supposed committee that includes 5 parties. I think it's France, the US, UNIFIL, Lebanon, and Israel. It's kind of this committee that will be looking at how to implement the ceasefire, delineate the border, and things of that nature. So the French have said that they counted, when it was published in Israeli media, about 50 some violations. So we've got multiple different sources here saying that the Israelis are violating quite regularly within the first week. Yesterday, Hezbollah decided to respond to those violations. Israel had claimed there were prior violations. They said there were suspects moving around the south in vehicles. It's unclear whether these were Hezbollah members or just civilians trying to return to their villages, as has happened a number of times. 2 journalists have already been wounded in the south. I think it was on the first day after the ceasefire. One an AP journalist and one from Sputnik. And so what we've seen here is essentially a number of violations. Hezbollah tried to respond to that yesterday, attacking what they said was a military post or a military site in the occupied Shabaa farms. They had 0 casualties and hit an open field. Israel said this was a gross violation and responded with airstrikes in the south, which killed close to, I think, around 9 people, if I'm not mistaken. This, I think, points to kind of this disproportionality and the fact that, as you mentioned, the Biden administration has failed to hold Netanyahu accountable. And despite the fact that we're now in a position where a ceasefire has theoretically been achieved, I should say that it does look like it will hold, as today was kind of a continuation of the week before yesterday. It didn't kick things off again to a high level, but that does kind of take us back to this point of how disproportionate this war has been, and how the fact, like you've mentioned, the Biden administration has not been willing to hold the Netanyahu government or the state of Israel accountable. Going forward, do you have any thoughts on this agreement till now, on the violations till now? And to me, it looks like we're in a place where it could very well hold, but I'm wondering if you have any other sort of thoughts based on the last week.
I think you're right. It seems like it will hold. I think we all hope it will hold. I mean, you mentioned your own experience on that Tuesday, especially Tuesday night before the ceasefire took effect. Israel did what it has done in past, anytime ahead of most past ceasefires, whether in Lebanon or in Gaza or elsewhere, of really intensifying the bombardment, intensifying until the very last hours of the ceasefire, intensifying and causing as much damage as possible, trying to displace many new people, and also just spreading fear, which I think was part of the strategy that that final night in Beirut, as you've written and as other journalists on the ground have written, to kind of leave that mark so that people think about that terror and think about that level of violence long after the ceasefire takes effect. And I think one of the things we've seen here, and I think you hit the nail on the head, in terms of lack of accountability from and lack of pressure by the Biden administration. It seems that the idea is to have a staggered withdrawal over these 60 days, both by Israeli military withdrawing the troops that have been occupying villages and areas along the border, so withdrawing those troops from the south, and then Hezbollah fighters would withdraw both the fighters and its weaponry north of the Litani River. That seems to be the general understanding of the framework, the general way that the parties have agreed to implement the UN Resolution 1701. But part of what's happening, and I would blame this partly on the Biden administration being toothless and not willing to confront Netanyahu and the Israeli government in any way, it is that Israel is already using Hezbollah movements within the south during this period of staggered withdrawal, that they're using these movements as an excuse to attack Hezbollah and attack villagers trying to return to their villages, attack based on all sorts of movements in the area during this period when there's supposed to be movement. Just logically, if we were to think about this, how are Hezbollah fighters and equipment and weaponry somehow how are they supposed to magically move north of the Litani overnight? Or they were supposed to have done it that Tuesday night before the ceasefire took effect. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and it just shows. I'm not even sure we could call it a double standard, because it even goes beyond the double standard, in that Israel can have its time and take maybe up to the 60 days to withdraw its troops, where Hezbollah is expected to have done everything already ahead of time, or else the Israelis would use this as an excuse to bomb further. I think part of what's going on is they're trying to, and you've made this point in some of your articles and on social media, is I think they're trying to push the limits as much as they can. They're trying to. The Israelis are trying to create new rules of engagement, and they have the upper hand. That's a big part of the problem, is that they think that they've destroyed Hezbollah's leadership and destroyed a major part of its capability, and impoverished large sections of the Lebanese population, especially the Shia population, where Hezbollah draws so much of its support and recruits, and also where it draws funding, people being able to contribute to Hezbollah. So in these ways, Israel is trying to push as far as it can, and we also have Netanyahu trying to deal with the domestic situation in Israel, where he has 60, 70,000 people who've been displaced from the north. Those residents haven't been willing to go back in the same way that residents of southern Lebanon are eager to go back to their villages. We have this situation where the Israeli public is pretty angry. Large segments of the Israeli public, including the supposed opposition, the Israeli political opposition, that's angry about a ceasefire and that wants Israel and wants the government to hit harder to, sort of continue an endless war similar to what's going on in Gaza. And that's the situation we're in. And we know that Netanyahu is always concerned about his political survival. So he seems to have an eye on that. And these violations of the ceasefire, I think, are partly intended to quiet some of that domestic criticism he's facing.
So, Mohamad, you wrote in your piece, I'm going to quote from your piece in The Guardian today, from December 3rd. You said, the battle spilled into clashes in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and the Red Sea as militias allied with Iran tried to pressure Israel and the U.S. into ending the attack on Gaza. Since then, we've also seen opposition forces move into Aleppo in Syria. There's now reports that Iraqi militias may, if they have not already, move into Syria to take part in the battle. There's talks about tensions rising in Jordan. It seems like the cat is already out of the proverbial bag. You say in your piece that there will not be short-term peace in the region until there is a ceasefire in Gaza. I guess my question is even that too late now? Or, what sort of effect and how important is it to still achieve that ceasefire in Gaza today?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and unfortunately, I'm convinced that we certainly need that ceasefire in Gaza, and we need that. That's the only way. That's been the only way to ensure a regional de-escalation, and some short-term peace in the region has been to stop the genocide, to stop the war in Gaza. And the Biden administration knows that. I think it's known that for many months, but Biden refused to use the most important leverage he had, and he had tremendous leverage. The U.S. has provided since last October, $22 billion, a little over $22 billion, both in direct military aid, weapons, and other support, jet fuel, and then something like $4 billion of that $4.5 billion is the U.S. costs for the increased operations they've had in the region, like attacking the Houthis in Yemen and operations in the Red Sea and elsewhere. So a tremendous amount of money, and then there are billions of more dollars, something like $20 billion in future U.S. weapons that will go to Israel, all paid for by U.S. taxpayers. All of that gives Biden tremendous leverage. I mean, look at the leverage Biden has been able to exert over Ukraine by sending billions of dollars in weapons. So he had that leverage. He's had it. He just refused to use it. And now he has run out of time because now he's a lame duck. He's been saying for months, Biden has been saying that he wants a ceasefire in Gaza. He provided this framework back in May. Hamas accepted it not long after, and in some ways began to undermine by accepting the general U.S. framework. Hamas started to undermine Netanyahu's stalling tactics. So then Netanyahu changed the terms, and and Biden never held them to account for that. So Biden essentially cornered himself, and I think you're right. He has run out of time at this point. We have to pin our hopes on Donald Trump at this point. It's unfortunate because Trump is unpredictable, and we also know that he's possibly even more partial to Israel and to Netanyahu. Although the way that Biden has behaved in the past year, it's also hard to see how any U.S. president would be even more supportive of Israel and of the Netanyahu government than Biden has been. So for the next, we have less than 60 days in this left in this administration. For that period, I don't think we're going to see a Gaza ceasefire, unfortunately, because Biden simply hasn't been willing to push Netanyahu in the ways that he needed to, and so we'll have this continued destruction, and the region won't know peace, and there won't be de-escalation until that war stops. So it's quite bleak. Hopefully, the ceasefire in Lebanon will hold, because that the alternative is even bleaker. The alternative is more months and weeks of widespread destruction in Lebanon, and displacement and everything we've seen over the past 2 months. So hopefully that ceasefire will hold. If there's one small ray of hope, I think it's that Trump has made clear that he wants these wars to end by the time he's inaugurated on January 20th. He's said consistently he doesn't want this distraction. Now, of course, Trump is partial, will give Netanyahu and the Israeli side whatever they want, and will use these threats as he did yesterday on Truth Social. He had this very bombastic post, basically threatening Hamas that he'll rain hell on them if they don't release the hostages and agree to a ceasefire by the time he's in office. So, in some ways, I hope that that's a negotiating tactic by Trump, as he's done about tariffs and other things. He can be very bombastic and try to show that he's in charge and that he's the boss ultimately. But yes, for the next 2 months or so, I think we're in this holding pattern where we're not going to see a ceasefire in Gaza, unfortunately.
Mohamad, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.